There's a very specific kind of pain that comes from loving someone who disappears the moment you get close. Not because they're cruel, not because they've stopped caring, but because your presence sets off something ancient and invisible buried deep inside them, something shaped by their past experiences long before you ever entered the picture. It is a confusing kind of heartbreak because there is no obvious villain. There is no simple explanation that makes everything easier to understand. One moment, you feel connected. You feel like the walls are coming down. You see glimpses of vulnerability, warmth, and emotional openness. You begin believing that something real is forming between you. Then suddenly something changes. The person who once leaned toward you begins creating distance. The conversations become shorter. The affection becomes harder to access. The person who seemed comfortable sharing parts of themselves suddenly retreats behind silence and emotional walls. And the hardest part is that their withdrawal often happens precisely when the connection starts feeling deeper. This can leave you questioning everything. Was I too much? Did I say something wrong? Did the connection mean more to me than it did to them? But sometimes the distance is not a reflection of your value. Sometimes it is a reflection of what closeness represents to them. For someone with avoidant attachment patterns, intimacy can activate a complicated emotional response. Connection may bring happiness, comfort, and a sense of being understood, but it can also awaken fears that have been stored for years. The nervous system does not always respond to emotional closeness based only on the present moment. It can respond based on old experiences, old expectations, and old protective strategies. A person may not consciously think, "I am afraid of intimacy, so I should pull away." It is often much more subtle. Their body and mind may simply begin searching for ways to create emotional distance when vulnerability starts feeling overwhelming. The closeness that feels comforting to one person may feel threatening to another, not because love itself is dangerous, but because love requires something they may have learned to avoid: openness. To truly let someone in means accepting uncertainty. It means allowing another person to matter. It means acknowledging that someone else's actions can affect your emotions. For someone who has built their sense of safety around independence and emotional control, this can feel like stepping into unfamiliar territory. They may begin experiencing thoughts like, "Why am I becoming attached? Why does this person matter so much? Why do I feel vulnerable around them?" Instead of moving toward those feelings, their instinct may be to create space. The distance can become a way of calming the internal storm. By stepping back, they may feel like they are returning to a familiar emotional position where they feel more in control. But the person on the receiving end experiences something completely different. You feel the sudden absence. You feel the shift. You feel the confusion of going from connection to uncertainty. It can feel like reaching for someone's hand and watching them slowly let go. That is the painful paradox of loving someone with avoidant patterns. The very thing that creates closeness can sometimes trigger the urge to escape. But understanding this dynamic is not about convincing yourself to accept endless distance or waiting forever for someone to overcome their fears. Compassion for someone's wounds should never require abandoning your own emotional needs. A person's fear of intimacy may explain their behavior, but it does not erase the impact of that behavior on you. Healthy love requires more than strong feelings. It requires two people who are willing to recognize their patterns and create something safer together. It requires communication instead of guessing, honesty instead of emotional disappearance, and effort instead of one person carrying the entire relationship. Sometimes the deepest realization is understanding that someone can care about you and still struggle to stay present. Someone can feel connected to you and still run from the vulnerability that connection creates. Their reaction may have started long before you arrived, but your healing begins when you stop seeing their distance as proof that you were not enough. Because sometimes you were not the reason someone pulled away. Sometimes your closeness simply revealed a place inside them that they had never learned how to face. Most people, faced with that disappearing act, do one of two things. They block or they beg. Blocking gives them a feeling of power. Begging gives them a feeling of being seen. and both feel like the only reasonable response to someone who pulls away without any explanation. But here's the truth nobody tells you. Neither strategy actually works. Not because you're doing them wrong, not because you're not loving enough or patient enough or strong enough. They fail because they're both, underneath it all, the exact same thing. They're both forms of chasing, and to an avoidant brain, chasing doesn't read as love, it reads as danger. Let me break down what I mean. When you block someone, you're attempting to seize back control. You're essentially saying, I'll hurt you before you get the chance to hurt me. That's not strength. That's fear wearing the mask of anger. And an avoidant person who has spent their entire life reading the emotional weather of everyone around them just to stay safe spots that mask instantly. They don't see someone finally standing up for themselves. They see someone whose need has grown so overwhelming that they'd rather destroy the connection entirely than sit with the uncertainty that terrifies them. Not because they're fragile in the way you might imagine, but because your need, expressed through anger or silence, confirms their oldest, deepest fear, that anyone who genuinely needs them will eventually try to consume them whole, so they retreat even further. And you, feeling that distance, either block harder or switch tactics entirely and start begging instead. Begging is the opposite of blocking, but it comes from the exact same wound. You beg because you simply can't tolerate the absence. You send the long message. You ask for one more conversation. You apologize for things you never actually did just to keep the door cracked open. And the avoidant person watching all of this feels something very particular. Yes, they feel guilt. But underneath that guilt sits something far more unsettling: disgust. Not disgust at you, but at the situation itself, at the fact that your need has become so visible, they can no longer pretend it doesn't exist. Their nervous system reads your begging as a demand to fill an emotional void they know, deep down, they simply cannot fill. They can't fill it because they've never filled their own. So they run, not because running brings them joy, but because it's the only strategy they've ever had. Here's the hidden truth most relationship advice will never tell you. An avoidant person doesn't fear your anger. Anger is clean. Anger is honest. Anger is something they can predict and prepare for. What genuinely terrifies them is your need. Because need is messy. Need is vulnerable. Need asks something of them they were never taught how to give. And when you block or beg, you're not actually hiding your need. You're broadcasting it. Blocking is need wearing the costume of pride. Begging is need wearing the costume of desperation. Both are still need. And to an avoidant person, need feels like a rope slowly tightening around their throat. So they cut the rope, not because they don't love you, but because cutting ropes has been their survival skill their entire life. You're about to learn something that will reshape the way you view every relationship you'll ever have. I'm going to walk you through why calm, unwavering presence, one that makes no demands, is the single most powerful thing you can bring to an avoidant partner. Not silence, not coldness, not manipulative games, but a stillness that quietly says, I'm here, I'm not leaving, and I'm not asking you to be anything other than exactly who you are. That sentence hits harder than any argument, any block, any tearful confession ever could, because it strips away their excuse entirely. It removes the story they've told themselves their whole life, the story that says everyone eventually demands too much, everyone eventually needs too much, everyone eventually becomes unsafe. The moment you stop chasing, you stop proving that story true, and that's the one thing they cannot outrun. If you've ever felt confused, exhausted, or completely broken by someone who pulled away right when you thought you were finally getting close, you're in exactly the right place. I don't deal in easy answers here. I deal in the truth, and the truth is often uncomfortable before it becomes freeing. So I genuinely encourage you to stick around, not for numbers, but because I want you to keep getting the kind of honesty most people are too afraid to offer. Honesty that doesn't blame you and doesn't coddle you either. The kind that looks at the avoidant person not as a villain and not as a victim, but as someone frozen in a posture of self-protection that stopped serving them a long time ago. By the time you finish this, you'll understand exactly why everything you've tried so far hasn't worked. And more importantly, you'll understand the one thing that actually might. Not a trick, not a manipulation, a genuine shift in your own nervous system that changes the entire dynamic between you. You might assume that when you block someone or go silent, they suffer immediately. They don't. The first thing they actually feel is relief, a deep, almost physical exhale. Finally, no more messages to ignore, no more expectations to fall short of, no more eyes watching to see if they care enough. That relief is completely real, but it doesn't last. Because underneath that relief, something else starts growing: emptiness, a hollow space where your presence used to live. And here's the crucial detail most people never grasp. They can't actually name that emptiness. They don't have the vocabulary for it. So they do what they've always done. They relabel it. They call it peace. They tell themselves, see, I'm fine on my own. I don't need anyone. But that's a lie their nervous system tells them to avoid facing a much deeper terror. The terror of realizing that your absence speaks louder than your presence ever did. Why is that? Because absence is safe. Presence demands something of them. Presence asks them to show up, to be seen, to risk actually being known. Absence asks for nothing at all. So they gravitate toward absence, not because they don't love you, but because to them, love has always felt like a demand wearing a disguise. But here's what they'll never say out loud. They notice you're gone. They notice it in the quiet mornings when there's no text waiting. They notice it in the evenings when there's no voice on the other end. They just won't admit it, not to you and not even to themselves. And this is the secret that unlocks everything. They aren't cold. Cold is a choice. They're frozen. Frozen is a state, a freeze response that looks like calm, feels like control, but is actually the body's oldest defense mechanism against a threat it can't escape. And in this case, the threat is their own need for you. Every time you react, every long message, every desperate call, you trigger something buried deep in their subconscious. Not anger, not annoyance, fear. A very specific fear that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with a lesson they learned before they could even tie their own shoes. Their subconscious whispers a sentence they've heard 1,000 times. If someone needs me this much, they will eventually trap me. That's not a conscious thought. It's a reflex, faster than logic, older than memory. And here's a layer most people never see. They aren't afraid you'll leave. They're afraid you'll stay. Because if you stay, if you actually need them, then they have to become something they genuinely don't know how to be: present, responsive, emotionally available. That terrifies them far more than abandonment does. Abandonment is familiar. Abandonment they've already survived. But being truly needed by someone who refuses to leave, that's unfamiliar territory, and their subconscious reads the unfamiliar as danger, so they pull away even harder, not because your reaction pushed them away, but because your reaction seemed to confirm their oldest fear was correct all along. Their subconscious says, see, you were right to keep your distance. Look how much they need. Look how unsafe that is. But here's the question they never think to ask themselves. What if the unsafe thing was never your need? What if the unsafe thing is actually their own inability to hold it? That question is the crack in their armor, a crack they'll spend enormous energy avoiding until something eventually forces them to look at it directly. Inside every avoidant person, there's a war going on, not the visible kind, but the kind that plays out in the dark between two parts of the same person. One part longs for closeness, wants to be held, wants to be truly known. That part is real. It isn't small and it isn't dead. It's just buried deep. The other part feels disgust, not at you, but at the longing itself, because to an avoidant person, longing looks exactly like weakness, and weakness, in their internal map of the world, leads to only one place: getting hurt again. So when you chase, when you lean in, when you ask for more, the disgust wins out. They pull away, not because they don't want you, but because the part of them that does want you fills them with a kind of nauseating shame. That's the truth nobody tells you. They aren't rejecting you. They're rejecting their own need for you. And that rejection feels to them like righteousness. But when you leave, when you actually stop chasing, something shifts. The disgust has nothing left to fight against. So the longing rises, finally safe enough to surface, because you're no longer demanding anything from them. But here's the agony buried inside that. Longing without safety is worse than no longing at all. It's a thirst they can't quench, because quenching it would require reaching out, and reaching out would trigger the disgust all over again. So they sit stuck in the middle, wanting you, hating that they want you, missing you, unable to make the call. And they call that state numbness. But it isn't numbness, it's a civil war, and nobody wins a civil war. They just survive it until something finally breaks. The avoidant attachment wound isn't what most people assume it is. It isn't primarily a fear of abandonment. Most people get that part wrong. The real wound runs older and far more claustrophobic than that. It's a fear of engulfment, of being swallowed whole, of losing themselves completely inside someone else's need. That's exactly why your anger doesn't work on them. Anger stays outside them. They can simply step around it. But your calm presence is different. That gets inside. When you stay calm, when you don't chase, when you remain warm but undemanding, you do something their nervous system genuinely cannot categorize. You're close, but you're not consuming them. You're present, but you're not asking anything of them. That breaks their entire defense system wide open, because that system was built for exactly one purpose: detecting and escaping demands. If there's no demand present, there's nothing left to escape from. So they stop running, not because they consciously choose to, but because their body has no instruction manual for running from someone who isn't chasing them. And in that stillness, something genuinely unsettling happens for them. They feel the original wound directly, the initial hurt, the child inside them who once needed and was turned away. That child has been frozen inside them for decades. Your calm presence doesn't attack their walls. Your calm presence makes their walls irrelevant. And a person without walls suddenly feels everything they've spent a lifetime avoiding. That's exactly why they might grow irritable or even more distant at first, not because your approach failed, but because their entire system is panicking. It's the panic of a building whose fire alarms have suddenly gone silent, and into that silence, for the first time, something real actually has room to enter. But whether they let it in depends entirely on what happens next. Most people expect an avoidant person to feel regret immediately after a breakup or a period of withdrawal. That's not how it actually works. For them, regret is a slow-acting poison. It doesn't hit as a wave of sadness. It creeps in as a strange irritation that surfaces during the second or third week of silence. Everything starts feeling slightly off. The coffee tastes different. The apartment feels too quiet. Their usual distractions start feeling hollow. But they can't connect this feeling back to you, because doing so would mean admitting you mattered. So they sit inside that irritation and call it boredom. But it isn't boredom, it's the first root of regret taking hold. And here's a layer most people never fully grasp. Their regret isn't really about what they did to you, it's about what they did to themselves. They lost someone who actually saw them, someone who stayed calm when everyone else would have panicked, someone who never needed to be fixed. That's genuinely rare, and somewhere inside they know it. Not at the front of their mind, but in the back. In the place where their subconscious quietly keeps score. They start replaying small moments, not the fights, but the quiet ones. The way you laughed, the way you listened without cutting in, the way you didn't chase them the first time they pulled away. Those memories don't show up as nostalgia. They arrive as a dull, unlocatable ache. And out of frustration, maybe they reach out with a cold, casual, just checking in text. That isn't love making a comeback. That's regret trying to soothe itself. But here's the danger they face. Regret that never transforms into accountability curdles into resentment instead. Resentment aimed at you for making them feel this way in the first place. And they might convince themselves that leaving was the right call after all. Not because it actually was, but because facing the real truth feels far too costly. The real truth is this: they aren't missing you. They're missing who they could have become alongside you. And that's a far heavier loss to carry. So they carry it in silence. And that silence grows heavier every day until something eventually cracks, or until they bury it so deep even they lose track of where they put it. But you, meanwhile, are no longer waiting by the phone. And that's the one variable their regret never accounted for. Beneath the regret, beneath the irritation, beneath the cold exterior they present to the world, there's something they will never say out loud. Longing, not the soft, gentle kind you read about in poetry, but a raw, aching, desperate longing to be seen and held and told they're enough without having to earn it first. But they can't voice this, not because they're stubborn, but because saying it out loud would mean admitting their entire survival strategy has been a lie, and that admission feels to them like death. So the longing lives buried in the basement of their psyche. It surfaces in strange, unexpected moments, a dream they can't quite explain, a sudden urge to call you at 2 a.m. that they immediately crush, a wave of sadness watching an elderly couple hold hands. They don't understand why that image stings, but it does, because it shows them something they've never had. The ability to stay, to tolerate closeness without fleeing, to be truly known without wanting to vanish. Here's the deeper truth underneath all of it. Their longing isn't really for you specifically, not at first. It's longing for the version of themselves who could have received your love without spiraling into panic. That version exists inside them like a ghost of the person they might have become if someone had held them gently as a child and told them, "You're allowed to need, you're allowed to stay." That ghost haunts them, and they'll spend years running from it. But sometimes, in the quiet hours, the running stops, and the longing finally rises to the surface. They won't call you, they won't send a message. They'll simply sit in the dark and feel something they can't quite name. That something is shaped exactly like you, the shape of what they lost, not because you left, but because they couldn't hold on to you. And that failure is the one wound their defenses can never fully cover. So they learn to live with the longing, carrying it around like a stone in their pocket, heavy, silent, never shown to a single soul. But the stone only grows heavier with time, and eventually they have to decide, keep carrying it alone, or finally set it down. But setting it down means reaching out, and reaching out means risking everything. So most of them do nothing at all. They wait, they hope. They waste years hoping you'll be the one to knock again. But you won't, because you've finally learned what they never did. Longing isn't a reason to go back to someone. It's a reason to change. And change is the one thing they've never learned how to do. So here's where we land. After all the silence, all the distance, all the moments you blamed yourself for not being enough. You were never the problem, not because you're flawless, but because the problem was never really about your shortcomings. It was about their fear, a fear so old and so deeply rooted that it wears the mask of strength. But make no mistake, avoidance is not strength. Strength is staying when staying is genuinely hard. Strength sounds like, I'm afraid and I'm going to stay anyway. Avoidance is the exact opposite. Avoidance is the art of leaving before you can be left. And that art can look almost beautiful to watch until you realize it's actually a cage. They're trapped inside it too, they just don't know it yet. You came here wanting to know what genuinely gets through to your avoidant partner. The answer isn't a trick. It isn't a mind game. It isn't blocking or begging or any of the strategies that keep you tethered to their emotional orbit. The one thing that hits harder than anything else is your calm, unwavering presence, offered without demand. Not coldness, not revenge, not silence used as punishment. Just a quiet, steady, I'm living my life kind of presence that says, I'm here, I'm not chasing you, and I'll be okay whether you stay or go. That sentence terrifies them more than any argument ever could because it removes their excuse entirely. It erases the story that you were too needy, too emotional, too much. And once that story disappears, they're left facing the one thing they've been running from their whole life, themselves. But here's a realization you probably didn't expect. This was never really about them. It was about you. About the person who's been waiting, hoping, analyzing, trying so hard to love someone who doesn't know how to receive love. That person deserves more than a life spent decoding someone else's fear. You cannot heal an avoidant person by shrinking yourself smaller and smaller. You cannot prove your worth by quietly accepting their distance. You can only do one thing, become someone who doesn't need them to change in order to feel whole. And that is the hardest, most liberating truth in all of human relationships. The moment you stop needing them to stay is the moment you become exactly the kind of person they might finally feel safe with. And if they never come back, you haven't lost anything real, only a ghost. The ghost of a relationship that was never fully there to begin with. Look at your own hands. They aren't empty. They've simply been gripping hope so tightly that you forgot how to let go. Let go now, not because you've given up, but because you've finally grown up, grown enough to understand that love was never meant to be a rescue mission. Love is two whole people standing side by side, each one fully capable of standing alone. If your avoidant partner can't stand beside you, that's their loss, not your failure. And if they do return one day, they'll be returning to someone who doesn't need them. That's the only kind of relationship that ever actually works. The kind where staying is a choice, not a necessity. Here's the final truth. You cannot force an avoidant person to truly see you, but you can stop disappearing in the attempt to be seen by them. That isn't rejection, that's liberation. And liberation is where everything real actually begins. Go live your life, not as some strategy to win them back, but as a quiet statement that you are always worth staying for, whether anyone ultimately stays or not. That's maturity, that's healing, that's the end of the chase and the beginning of something that finally, genuinely matters. You, whole, unafraid at last.